My name is Aljamal Bindin, and I'm the chair of the board of MORE. What we have today is a special event or edition. We're going to talk about a book and have hopefully what we call a conversation or discussion about this book and what it's all about. The name of the book is called Later Life in South Africa. It's Solomon J. Plate, and facilitated by myself. And of course, the Movement of Race Equity is the organization that's sponsoring this event. I'm going to outline a little bit of the ground rules for today. One is just a brief introduction, a little about who I am. Then also I'm going to talk a little bit more about kind of like the co-sponsors and kind of go through this a little bit. But my name is Aljamal Bindin. Sometime I go by the pen name of the Wise One. When I was in Botswana, I had a nickname called Muntu Rakletso, which is a long story. And then sometimes people call me Muntu Lakoa, which means basically a white, kind of a black guy who speaks English, or kind of a strange way that they played with me on that one. As I said, this is co-sponsored by Tswana History Matters, which is out of Botswana. Afro America, which is a local African focus group that deals with issues related to Africans and bringing the greater relationship between African Americans and Africans and other people in the community. Inclusive Community, which is a group that deals a great deal with diversity issues, of facilitating diverse conversations and so on. And then there's a couple of national groups that agreed to co-sponsor. Was IDEA, which is Inclusive Diversity, Equity, and Awareness. It's a book club out of Florida. And there's another book club that's out of Arizona called Unity Initiative. And so they also agreed to co-sponsor this. This is out of Arizona. And the concept of this event is to contribute to Dr. Victoria Ndozinani Mclengeni Bindin. And we're going to talk about her for about 5 minutes. I also want to give a shout out to my sister-in-law. She's watching, my niece and nephew, Kutu and Speedway Balasang. Fanny Balasang is my sister-in-law. And a disclaimer, this is a presentation from my eyes and my perspective in a sense. And again, others can offer constructive feedback and criticism. The book itself, written by Plati, Native Life in South Africa, is about 437 pages. So I'm not going to give its due in the short time of this presentation. And also, we like to have people have constant new ideas related to the book. When you read the book each time, there's some information that you learn that is new information. I'm just, like I said, I'm going to provide maybe an overview of about 25 minutes or so, and then a summation of 5 minutes. And then we're going to open it up for about 15 minutes or so for that, and the question answers, and of course, the evaluations. This is kind of the framework. As I said earlier, I'm 45 years ago, I joined the Peace Corps and served 2 years in the Republic of Botswana. I came from a family of 14 children, born in Hastings, Nebraska. Grew up in a small town for a little bit, for like maybe a year or two, and then we moved to Omaha. And so I grew up here with my siblings. I attended the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, where I got a BA or BS rather in political science and minor in history and psychology. And I was going to be a social studies teacher, but I figured out with the way that I approach life and talk and so on, I may not survive in terms of the educational system. And then again, I was my mother was part of the group who sued the school district in Omaha for integration. Again, we had a very apartheid segregated community in Omaha. And so again, she was about that in 1976, 1973 area. After I was one of 10 children who graduated from the university out of 14. And after I got my first degree, instead of going for a job, I decided to join the Peace Corps. And I wanted to go to Botswana or go someplace in Africa and learn about the motherland. Over the years, I've taught as an adjunct professor at Metro Community College, School of Allied Health and Nursing, University of Nebraska Social Work Department. I taught their first African-American family class in the university, and also I taught, I think, their first poverty class, and it was also a graduate class. I also taught somewhat time in the Black Studies Department for about 5 years. But the whole time I was teaching, I was working full-time at Catholic Charities. As probably the longest serving atheist who worked in a Catholic Charities agency in the country. And this concept, and I'm going to switch up, this concept came because of, in my job at Catholic Charities and Table Talkers, we did a lot of discussions on racial issues with different people. And we facilitated these conversations. At the height of the program, about 10 years ago, we had like 650 people having dinner over race, talking about race issues, and they was facilitated dinners and throughout the city, and people really enjoyed it. The second part of it is that Vicki and I was watching August 15th on this computer, we call it a webinar from the University of Cape Town. Barbara Boswell, Dr. Boswell, gave an overview of a book called Writing is a Practice of Freedom from a University of Cape Town. And the book she was talking about dealt with Loretta Ngoblo. I'm not pronouncing that right, I'm sure. But we were impressed with Dr. Boswell's research and analysis of this book and said, hey, we could probably do that. And Vicki over the years have not done a lot of public speaking with me, but again, we decided we are going to do that. And it was, again, our appreciation of the book, as well as the way Dr. Boswell talked about African literature, and particularly someone who had passed to the spirit world, and so on. So this is a tribute to Victoria. She's passed on to our ancestors as of September the 6th, and she would have wanted me to continue this assignment. When you hear people say that they hear voices in their head, I can tell you that's true. I do hear voices in my head all the time, and I know I would tell you that one of them is my mother, who used to pass away about 12 years ago, and now I hear Vicki talking to me sometime. Again, it's people giving you direction and feedback from that ancestors world. Ndozi displayed in Vicki unconditional love for not only her family, but also for her community, the press, her culture, both in South Africa and Botswana. And also she was very much involved in supporting the work on struggle for racial equality, and particularly, as I said, helping people in our community. One of the things that I oftentimes talk about, and I think is probably part of this, is that when I arrived in Botswana in 1977, which was probably a few weeks after Steve Biko was murdered by the South African racist authorities. Vicki arrived probably about 2 or 3 months before that. And so after she had just got back from medical school in Yugoslavia, in a small village she was working in Molopolole. And one day I went out with the guys to the small bar in Molopolole. It's a cafe type. She sat behind me and we started talking. I asked her to come sit next to me. She refused. And the reason I started talking to her because she had a different hairstyle. I thought she was from a different country. But anyway, I told some of the Botswana folks that I wanted to meet her again. They said the best way to meet her was to go to church. Now, again, I was not a church person, but that following Sunday, I went to church. It was a small chapel on the hospital grounds in Molopolole. And the whole time, Dr. Motherweather, who was also a physician, but he was also a minister, was speaking. I was busy looking at Vicki, which I didn't hear much of the scriptures that day, but she invited me over for dinner. And as I say, the rest is history. We dated for about 1.5 years, and then we got married a little bit later than that. One of the things that I will say is Dr. Motherweather also was one of the speakers of the assembly when Botswana got its independence, as well as a physician, and he was also the president's physician also. I had a chance to meet him a few times when I was in Molopolole. I'm not going to spend much time talking about our relationship, but I will share that she guided and helped transform me. Vicki, my experience in Botswana showed me a lot of unconditional love, and so with her family. They made me feel at home, and Botswana was like a wonderful place for me. I didn't really have negative experience. It was just positive the whole 2.5 years I was there. And again, her mother, by the way, her mother and her father came from South Africa through the Transkei as refugees in the 1940s, and Vicki was born in Botswana, but she was closer from the South African part of that world. Again, one of the things I also like to say is that when Vicki would say to the children that leave the house, she would say, I want you kids to do bad because you should remember the name. Many people from Botswana will understand that concept, because basically you tell your kids you belong to the family, so don't embarrass us. Because again, it was one of those things that she said. One of the things that many of my children know, she said to me too, because I was a little bit hot-headed, she would say, remember the name, so don't go out there and embarrass me in the community or at work or whatever. One of the key things she used to always say was, God bless you, I love you, and stay focused. Those are her themes to her kids. And unlike me, when I talk to the kids as they became adults, I would say, where's your cell phone, where's your wallet, and also where are your keys, so that I wouldn't have to deal with some of that. But again, one of the things that was very powerful is that after we got married, we went to the Transkei and I met her uncle. And one of the stories, and this is going to be probably my last story until I move into the presentation, because I'm conscious of time. One of the stories, when we traveled to the Transkei after I was married, probably about 3 months later, to visit her uncle, Malomi, we say Malomi Rusile, he was an uncle. And she also had an aunt at the time. Her aunt passed away a while back, and uncle didn't pass this year. We went to meet him at his place of work when we got to the Transkei in Butterworth. And we went to there, and the first thing he did when we met him, they were talking a little bit, and then he reached out to shake my hand. When he grabbed my hand, he wouldn't stop staring at me. He looked at me for about 30 seconds, and I thought if I looked down, he's going to slap me upside the head. I didn't know if it was a closer ritual or something, but I didn't look down. I didn't know if I was supposed to hit him back or not, because he was much older than me, but I was somewhat scared, but I didn't tell them. But what was unfortunate is Vicki and her mother just looked at me, and they didn't say anything to translate what was going on, but He looked at me a little bit blank and he said, started laughing, said, "You're okay, you're all right." And that was it. So that was part of my experience in the Transkei. I stayed there for about a week and so on. But it was a wonderful, powerful experience to see South Africa and particularly Botswana during that time. So let me move into the presentation, which I think is probably the key here, is that what I'm going to do is use the background a bit about what happened in terms of the demographic information and also some observations of the book. And then I'm going to give us a chance, obviously, to contribute and share other ideas and so on. But basically, the way this went out is that there was a background in 1800. There was the Boers or the South African Voltrekkers. They settled in the country somewhat earlier than that, but they had this relationship with the British and so on. And they created a system of what we know as today as apartheid. And oftentimes people look at what happened, they think it just happened recently, but it happened a long time ago. But there was roughly about 4,500,000 Black South Africans there, and 250,000 of whites and so on. And 1.5 million whites. And again, they controlled many of the urban areas. And the demographics are in the book, so I'm not going to go through that. But Blacks owned a small percentage of the land. In actual fact, whites owned about 14 times the land of the Africans, the Black Africans in South Africa. And again, that's where most of the conflict started from. Basically, they developed what they call, they started a process where they started the rules of starting to create laws and so on to deal with that. Now, I kind of jumped ahead, but I missed a point. Solomon Platte was born in the Orange Free State in 1876 near Kimberley. His kinship was part of the Barolong tribe, southern part of Africa, and also parts of Botswana and the Barolones, as we would say back then, Botswana Land Protectorate. The book does not share much about his personal life, but it outlines what he did and with other South Africans to struggle and challenge that apartheid system back then. And for your information, I do have reference in the back if you want to know about his life, and I think it's a very complex and powerful life, what he did. You may have to see Brian Williams' book that was written some years ago, where he talks about him in terms of this biography. Platte was a journalist. He was Tswana speaking, and he also spoke other languages. One of the things I will also say is that his goal was to improve the life for people in South Africa during that time. It was very difficult. He was part of the group that helped start the African National Congress back in 1913. And again, they had a couple of meetings. One was in Johannesburg and so on. Now, one of the things I want to say that in terms of my observation of this book, June 20th, 1913 was the key date that they started the Native Life in South Africa law. That whole process, the native laws, where again they started to separate many of the Africans, indigenous African, Black Africans, and the whites, and so on. And they also made it so much difficult for them. Again, it was a case where they displaced millions of Black South Africans who worked on farms. Many of them were sharecroppers. Almost when this law came into effect, it made them almost serfs in a sense, or semi-slaves. It grew a lot of hardship. They had to get the cattle off the land. And again, most of this happened in the Orange Free State, where most of the Boer or the white South Africans were at. And again, this excluded Botswana Land Protectorate, but again, some of this did bleed over back in terms of how they treated. It was very harsh conditions for the South Africans in the Orange Free State. And again, as I said, there was laws that were enacted that gave the white landowners a great deal more power back then. The natives could not buy land, they couldn't sell land to each other, and then those who were leasing lands from the South African whites, they had to get off the land. And part of the mentality was they wanted to force more of the Africans to go into the work in the gold and other mines there. There are other Blacks and so on, Africans in government service or different positions. They had to get out of their jobs because they wanted to make sure that all the whites had employment. And we're talking about 1913. The other thing that I would say about this book is that part of the book, when you read it, is somewhat dry in some areas because he shares a lot of the government documents. Platte, as I said, he was a journalist, so he has a flair for writing. And he also was very much one of the first South Africans to write a novel, Mahoodi, that is an excellent book to read. It was written, published in the 1930s in that area. This registration process for these South Africans after they lost the land, they had to register land, they had to have pass laws. Again, many of them went homeless in a sense, and they had a hard time making ends meet. And part of what happened is that they also made them give half of their sharecropping stuff. Again, a part of the same thing we had in the United States in the South, where they had to give a lot of their sharecropping incomes back to the white farmers who the land they lived on. Now, remember, many of the Africans, most of the Africans were there before the Europeans got there. But again, this is how they enacted those laws and so on. The book has a lot of strange, crazy racist language. Again, it talks very strongly about African folks in derogatory terms. Not only was that used by the British, but as well as the South African whites. And it reminded me of the Deep South here in the United States. There's a lot of commonality of how Africans were treated in South Africa and how African Americans were treated in the South, and particularly in the United States, in the country. The other observations that I have with the book is that he questioned the role of churches. You ask yourself, and those who are religious minded, what was the church doing? The Boers of the South African Afrikaners belong for the most part to the Dutch Reformed Church, and Platte made fun of the church in his book many times with some of the scriptures and the way he played with words, but he oftentimes just said it was the role of hypocrites in terms of how they operated, but they would not allow Africans to go to their churches. And at one point, someone in the book went to the church and they kicked him out and had him arrested. So again, it reflects some of the stuff that happened here in the United States. This would not have happened without the parliament in South Africa when they was involved in setting these laws up. Again, they could not do much with the protectorates, and the protectorates got some of their support when they got their protectors from Britain, where South Africa could not invade or take over their country. And so it was a very brilliant move on behalf of the Botswana chiefs and the people from Swaziland, as well as Lesotho, to do that. So again, they became somewhat protected, where the South African Boers could not invade them because they had the technology, the guns, and so on. And that's how they were able to do what they did in Southern Africa. These past laws and the taxes, they had an enormous level of taxes on the natives, and they were excessive. In actual fact, Platte points out that the taxes were sometimes 2 to 3 times of what the white person would play or the Boers would play in South Africa, as well as the salary structure has the disparities back there. And so you have a situation where National Party legalized racism and harsh treatment on apartheid. Now, what's interesting is sometimes people think by reading on the internet or learning about South Africa and Southern Africa that apartheid started in 1948. No, it started much before that, and Platte talks about that in the book. He alludes in the book, and again, the page numbers are out there, and we'll put this on the website because I'm talking fast and I need to slow down. But there was a time when whites and Black race were never really on equal footing. They were closer in the Cape area, Eastern Cape, and down in the area by Cape Town. But there was never really this full equality in terms of civility and politically, and Platte says that very well in that. The old Cape Constitution was a little bit more liberal because, again, it had some input from the British when they had conflicts and dealt with some of the issues in that country right before the Boer War and so on, and even afterwards. Platte at one point was very upset. Solomon was very upset about what happened, and he worked with a number of Africans, and they basically got to get a delegation together and decided to go to London to appeal to the British government to help them pull these Boers off their neck and reform the system so that it was not that oppressive in South Africa. Well, he went there for a while, a month or so. He basically did not get the kind of support that he thought he would get with his delegation of 5 people. And again, at the same time, this is 1913-14 area, World War II started, and World War I started rather. And so they did not give him the attention he deserved. He also didn't get attention from some of the people he talked to in Parliament, as well as the Aborigine society. Is called the Aborigine Protection Society in London, that was supposed to help many of these indigenous groups from across the globe that the British people colonized and messed around with. Towards the end of the book, he talked about the Boers basically had this support with the German government and particularly World War I, where they wanted to be neutral. And some of you may not know that the German government controlled Southwest Africa, which is now Namibia, and they massacred, and there's a brutal massacre of the Hereros that happened back in those days. In actual fact, before they did their dirt to the Jewish people in the Holocaust in the 1939 to 1945, they did similar situations to the Boers. The Boers did that to the South Africa people who lived in the Namibia area, and so the history delineates that very closely. The one name that I will mention was General Louis Botha. He was, again, later became president. but he was Mr. Evil incarnated when you read the book, and kind of a two-faced politician at times, but he was also a general that was very popular with the South African authorities. He also was heading up the Native Affairs Department, which was controlled again by the Boers. And what was interesting, Plaatje said that they had to pay the taxes, support these all-white departments that were very oppressive, and their departments virtually worthless in the struggle of them trying to get more independence back in the 1930s and so on, the 1913 and so on. One of the things that I would just say, and again, I want to be conscious of not taking too much time to say that there are some takeaways that I got from reading the book. One, in chapter 19, Botswana Protector did push back at the Boer War. I didn't know much about what happened in terms of what happened in Botswana land. In terms of a Chief Linswe, he was of, I think, Bakata, had some defensive fights with some of those Boers from the Transvaal. We tried to invade and take some of the cattle and things like that. And by the way, cattle raiding was much more common in the Barelone and the Boers back in those days. And again, that's delineated in page 289. This book, for me, demonstrates that our ancestors fought against racism and pre-official apartheid. Again, as I said earlier, we sometimes think this is something that happened within our lifetime. And again, it happened almost a few generations ago. This book helps me to understand and illustrates the global wealth that was hijacked off the backs of the press, our Africans in South Africa. And again, it provides the breadcrumbs, or we would say the heavy knowledge on how to unravel this mess that we're in now as Africans, African Americans, and other press people and people of goodwill. Smaller people and the Basutus did not get, I think, the historical credit for their resistance to the Boers, and you don't see that in some of the common history books out there, but you'd have to read some of to see that they were very clever. They did a lot to keep those folks off their neck, and again, to stop them from taking away. A couple of the summations that I have for this is from Plaatje is that he did correspond with W.D. Du Bois. He actually came to Canada and the United States for a while. And he also quotes W.D. Du Bois in Native Life. So he was trying to start an international support with some African Americans in this country doing their civil rights. He spent a lot of time overseas, and I think that was one of his, in other countries, I think that was one of his downfalls. And I say that very politely and respectfully because he was trying to raise money for the cause, but it also, by him as a breadwinner and a father being away, caused him to lose his newspaper business that he had. And also his family kind of fell apart, had some problems financially helping his family when he was overseas. And he had to borrow a great deal to keep them afloat. Again, you'll find more about his life in the biography more so than this book because he doesn't speak much about himself. I think he was a very humble person. The South African government also took away, the British government were in collaboration when he appealed to them on several occasions with his delegation. They kept saying that basically we can't interfere in the internal affairs of an independent country in a sense, even though they helped South Africa to set up that whole system of what they have there. And they also did, from reading the book, a number of weak winks for him. The book was written in 1913, folks. It reads like a newspaper in some aspects, in some sections, and it also reads like a history book. But it illustrates how South Africa became a racist apartheid country for many of the Africans living there. And if I was to translate some of the concepts in this book, I could put a template over what this United States would like had the South, the Southern Confederate folks would have won the Civil War. Again, some of the same mentality or things that was there. Now, one of the things I did say, looked at, and I said, there should be some reparations. You look at all the history and the trickery that took place in South Africa to deal with the income and wealth disparities and the historical injustice and racist laws. And again, as the United States, we can go back and see who has some of those money today. One of the things that I came up with, and I think is part of this conversation, is that when you read a book like this, there are things you walk away and what are your takeaways? It's like when you participate in a discussion, or you participate in engaging on something as significant as these issues is, what do you do after that? Too often we read these books, we learn from these things, and we do nothing. This is one of the cases I think there's some recommendations we could do. And I say that very seriously because oftentimes when we look at history or look at our communities, we become passive or bystanders, or we call do nothing personalities. But some of the recommendations I would make for after reading this book is we must develop better education for our families and communities and nation. And when I was in Botswana, I was interested in the history of African literature and books and so on. And I met a young guy who was a refugee from Zimbabwe. And he says, whenever you read a book written about our country, look at who was the writer. He was basically saying, make sure that they're from the country or indigenous, but at the same time, he says, don't ignore other people from outside who write books. But again, those who are the closest to our issues can and grew up in our culture can better define some of the challenges we face. The other thing I think from reading this book, we must push back at laws and policies and regulations and issues that do not always allow the common folks at the table. And this is something that Plache experienced himself as a South African and as a Tswana speaking person when he was trying to provide this movement to reverse that apartheid evolution in South Africa. As Malcolm X says, the little man has nothing to lose, man, woman, whatever, because again, at the bottom, when you're going through this oppression, you have to fight back, and too often our systems educate and teach us to be pacifier, the experience pacification, and to look the other way, when in actual fact, people are doing the kind of the dirty things that they're doing in our societies. And we must also, when looking at Plache's book, is understand that back then, as well as today, there's a maldistribution of wealth and income in our respective societies, South Africa, the United States, and elsewhere. So some of this starts with our government taxing system is very regressive, and it burdens low-income people and people who are poor. We must talk about fair wages, not only in South Africa, but in the United States. And again, this is all delineated clearly in this book about what they went through. And again, he provides those breadcrumbs or the roadmap for us to look at what happened back then. And as we always said, we must stay in motion. So when Father Time catches us, we will always be in motion to help deal with some of these issues. One of the things that I do provide on the PowerPoint, because I think the book is more of a historical narrative of what he went through dealing with the Native Lands Act that basically took their land from them and also relegated them to this kind of serfdomship. But he also, I recommend that you need to look at other books and other articles and so on. So he wrote this book back in it got published, I think, in 1930, right in that time. He died in 1930 or 32, I think. And he was originally, I said earlier, from Kimberley. But the other reading book that I think you have to read is Brian Williams' books I said earlier. He wrote that, and it's a biography. It's probably about 400 pages. I haven't had a chance to read that, but that's my next book on my shelf, as they say, sitting by my bedside, that I need to read, because again, it gives me a little bit more complexity of what this individual Plache went through to get to where he did. Because again, the guy was a very strong and hard worker about social justice and dealing with anti-apartheid work. The other thing that we must do is also look at other history books. There's a book that was written by Leonard Thompson, The History of South Africa. It got a number of good reviews, including Bishop Tutu says it's a good book to read to understand that. And then the last point I would like to say is that one of the things that I've learned about African culture, not only in terms of Southern Africa, but East Africa and West Africa, is probably reading the literature. And reading books by different authors who talk about some of their issues from a novel point of view or from different fictional points of view and so on. So I would recommend picking up books about other cultures in order to get into their culture. And that's what helped me develop a greater appreciation for Botswana by reading Bessie Head and some of the other writers. Peter Abrahams is from South Africa. I was loved to read. I read his book, A Wreath for Numa, which reminds me of what happened in Zimbabwe. But these books can provide that roadmap and that connections to help us build social capital with other people in other parts of the world, is what we need to deal with as to push back and again develop this greater awareness of our history and our backgrounds and so on. There's another book, and this is the last book I'm going to recommend. Well, it's two books. Samuel Plache's book, that the novel he wrote, I said that earlier, you need to read that. But the last one is George M. Frederickson wrote a book called White Supremacy, a comparative study in African and South African history. And the reason why this is very close to home to me is when I came back from Botswana and I was working on my specialist degree, which is like 36 hours beyond a master's degree. I did a comparative analysis of the South African apartheid education and what existed here in Omaha as my specialist degree thesis. And I will tell you, I had a hard time from some of my professors because they didn't think it was one and the same. But what I argued that the theme of this thesis is the outcomes. And too often we as Africans, African Americans, people of goodwill, whoever, we look at systems, but we never look at outcomes, or we look at outputs, we look at outcomes. So when you have a system that continually produces failures for kids, something's wrong with that system. And as we say in Botswana and elsewhere, when the whole class fail, we don't always say there's something wrong with the students. We say something's wrong with either the teachers or the system sometimes. So we need to be looking at these events and looking at them from a different perspective. and again, look at how these things evolve, because it is through history that we become very much aware of ourselves. And again, this book, I think, provides that foundation. But as Carter G. Woodson, Carter G. Woodson said, I miss his name sometime, switch it around. He says, sometimes you want to hide stuff from people, you put it inside of a book. So we need to look at books and look at more things that relate to our culture, and also develop greater bridges amongst other people who experience certain negative situations, so that we can have a commonality to overcome some of these atrocities that happen in our history. And most of all, we want to not let people to divide us from our histories and our culture and our people that have sustained us to this point. And so at this point, I'm going to stop. And again, open it up for folks who may have comments, other feedback, any of the other co-sponsors. But I think that this is the kind of thing that helps me and helps us to be, as they say, we come in as strangers, we go out as friends, to help develop their friendship across different issues of racial lines and so on. So let me stop right there. And if folks would like to raise a question, a comment, feedback, or even have another interpretation of some of the things that I've shared. And obviously, one of the things that I will tell folks is that I constantly mispronounce people's names and places. So you may have to show me grace in that area. So we'll stop right there and open it up. And we're about halfway through here, right on time. Feedbacks, reactions, observations. Do you guys speak English? I mean, can y'all understand English here? It's kind of quiet. Oh, I slipped in. I shouldn't be talking like that. And also, this is Facebook Live. And Dilly, I don't know if you can see the Facebook, if there's any comments or anything coming in from Facebook from people. You may have to read those out because I don't have my Facebook page out.
All right, I got you.
Was I talking too fast that y'all didn't hear me or something? Or was I might have been speaking Xhosa Zulu or something. Maybe y'all didn't hear me.
Hear you loud and clear. Loud.
Okay. Sometimes y'all scare me. It's like in the classroom, like, are y'all here today?
Oh, we hear you loud and clear. You good.
Judy's trying to talk.
Oh, thank you. Hi, everybody. Hi, Jamal.
All right, finally we meet. Nice to
I
meet you.
know. That was wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that about that book. Everybody else on the call, I'm Judy Kigiri. I am the co-founder of Afro Omaha, an organization here in Omaha, Nebraska, and we are primarily in the business of pushing African culture forward. So we're super excited to have shared and be part of this. I am originally, not just originally, I hold a US passport, but I am Kenyan. And so this had a lot of similarities to some of the history of Kenya, especially where the colonialists are, where the colonialists are concerned. So thank you again for sharing it. One of the things that we did, and we talked about this in our conversations prior, is we've been reading a lot of African literature because, as you said, if you want to hide stuff from people, you put it in a book, because people just generally don't like. It's not that they don't like, maybe that there's just not that culture of a reading, but I think it's really important because it helps you know, one, where you're from, two, what the struggles are that your people actually went through and where you are right now, as well as just hearing things and learning things from a perspective of the people who actually went through or who actually endured some of those things. So thank you again for sharing.
Judy, before you go, I want to raise one point. When you and I talked earlier, I told you my favorite writer was the Kenyan writer,
Yeah.
but I mispronounced his name. And say more a little bit about him just briefly, because I think he's probably the best writer of all. I've read Achebe, I read Soko, you name them. But I think his writing style is different. He lives in the United States. But just briefly, just say something about him, because I think if you read his Devils on the Cross, Petals of Love, Wheat Nap Child, it's like you're walking in Kenyan society, and he no longer writes in his English anymore. He writes in his native language, which I think you belong to the same group or tribe. The other thing is he lives in the United States, so he got exiled for a while. He went back, had a terrible time, came back to the United States. But just briefly say a little bit, make sure we pronounce his name right, but why his book is just so good. I mean, the guy is, to me, number one.
Yeah, sure. So you are referring to Ngugi wa Thiong'o.
Right, exactly.
And he is Kenyan. He's not won, one of the quote unquote big prizes in literature. unfortunately so. I don't know who all these other undeserving people are who have gotten it so far. And I'm saying that, of course, not having any bias as being a fellow Kenyan, but he's written several books that are just absolutely stellar. One of the things that I have always wanted to watch is a play that he did way back before he was exiled, but it was basically he writes about the history of Kenya, he writes about the ills, he writes about colonization and many other things. He did get exiled, so he lives in the US. He teaches at University of California. I think it's Riverside or North, somewhere down like in Southern California. His children, both of them, exemplary writers who have gotten probably a lot more accolades than he did during his time. He primarily, he also wrote about the decolonization, right, of our minds. And one of the things that he did is he absolutely stopped writing in English. So he only writes in his mother tongue, which is also my mother tongue, Kikuyu. Which
Ooh.
I will say that I am very shabby at reading. So I primarily read his books when I was in high school because they were set books, meaning that we had to read them because we read a lot of African literature when I was in high school. But yeah, if you are looking for someone to read, it is dense reading. I will tell you that. It is not, just, fly by the
Right,
seat of your pants, like pick it up and
right.
read it. He
Yeah,
gets into detail. The way his style of writing, his
yeah,
stylistic
yeah,
approach is very different.
yeah,
So, just go with it, but it's actually a fantastic
yeah.
read.
The other thing I did not say is that one of my persons that I met when I was in Botswana, who grew up in South Africa, said that she didn't learn about African history per se because she went to a missionary or church school, and so they didn't teach about the culture. So a lot of the stuff she had to learn on her own. So wrestling is so important to read the literature, their history books, and again, as we say, self-educate yourself on these issues. Other comments, other reactions, other feedback.
Hello.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Merabelo. I'm currently in Botswana, watching you from Botswana. And thank you very much for that wonderful presentation on Saul Plaatje. One of the things that I find very interesting is the fact that the apartheid government in South Africa during the apartheid era decided that a lot of the stuff that Africans were being taught through the Bantu education, they actually had a system called the Bantu education, was that a lot of the things that were being taught to students should only be like mental stuff where they have to recite and remember things, and very, very few things were written down. So for Saul Plaatje to have done this, to have written this book far back in the early 1900s is just so phenomenal. And, because of copyright issues and laws and all those kind of things, all these things pretty much remained hidden from the rest of the world until I think about maybe 10, 20 years ago when they fell out of copyright. So I was very happy to get hold of this book, like an ebook somewhere for free. And I read it. I haven't finished it, but I feel like all you've said, you've pretty much given me the opportunity to kind of grasp it to the end. So for that, I appreciate. And, things were really tough. And I remember when I was a little girl going through primary school, it was, this thing of Botswana and South Africa are like surrogate siblings, if I can call them that. You have more Tswana people in South Africa than currently in the Republic of Botswana. We used to be the same people. Because of the Berlin Conference and the carving up of Africa and things like that, we became separated. So Plaatje was very much one of our own. And even though Botswana was spared from the brutality of the apartheid system, we still had some residual effects of it seeping into our country. So I remember when I was a little girl still at primary school, they were just beginning to phase out that thing where you had to learn everything by rote. Like, we had very few books, and some of them were written in South Africa. They were just like the vestiges of the last of the colonial stuff. you know. So it's very refreshing to finally get hold of the books ourselves so that we can read for ourselves, written by our own people. We kind of knew what Black South Africans were going through, even though it didn't affect us directly as much as it did them. So it's a very, very, how should I say this? For me, it kind of makes my heart soar a little bit, but still, these are the realities that we have to face, embrace, and see how they can help us move forward as a people.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Well, the other thing is when I teach or talk, I like to tell stories. But when I first got to Botswana, I heard the music you heard earlier in Paranyana. And so I'm getting off the airplane. They put us, all of us, Peace Corps, on a bus to go when we got to the train station. And they're playing this music like that. I'm like, what's going on? So probably about a few weeks into the country, after they give us a week or two of orientation, they put me in Mahalapi in a village, which is probably 2 hours away from Gaborone, the capital. So one night I went out with the fellows to a bar, and there was this one guy who had been drinking a little bit, and he was dancing. And he was dancing on one leg, and I was like shocked. I said, I don't know how to dance on one leg, but again, it was these cultural experiences of Botswana, the culture, the people, the way they talk. Like I say, it was just wonderful. And again, it helped that I met my to-be wife early in the country, because she helped guide me to some of these more indigenous, powerful experiences. And also, if you're an African-American in Botswana, they put extra pressure on you to speak the language and say things. So for example, I used to tell my wife, Kea Harata, Omunkle, and then in close Diatanda. In other words, you learn this language of love. And she sometimes would say it back to me, except when she's mad, she wouldn't say, I love you or something like that. She was like, get out of here, footsack or whatever. But again, you pick up the language and you pick up the culture. And again, there was this expectation. But the other thing is, when you're in a country for 2 years and you're learning the language, you're hearing it, sometimes you can hear what people are saying and tell from intonations about that. But Botswana was a very powerful metamorphosis for me. And one of the ways I describe it to people is almost like going to heaven, especially when you're in the majority. If you're not experienced that living in an apartheid place like Omaha, where you're in the minority and you deal with race issues and racism all the time. But yeah, it was a wonderful experience to see parts of the country. I developed a fear of flying, so I didn't go back until probably 20, 30 years later. I went back about a year or two after I got back here, but that stayed a long time. When I went back, the place has completely changed than what it was from 77 to 79. In actual fact, when I went to Mafeking place, I started staring at people because I thought I was in the United States. They look so much alike, and the countries and the technology. And sometimes it's hard to describe countries unless you go there, but some of us still have those same images in our mind of these countries and African folks. And so you almost have to travel. And again, I will say to you emphatically, through the literature, through the books, through the people, you learn a great deal about the world that we oftentimes don't see through our filtered media and journalism in this country. Other feedback, other reactions. I see something else is here. Was there anything surprising in the Plate books from other people or so on? I gave some things that hit me. I was just surprised how well he documented stuff. That like I said, I didn't know the book was out there until recently. But I also have I would say this, what really moved us is to see other people who have appreciation and love for other countries and culture. And sometimes those of us who live in our own culture, we need outside to see us, as that African proverb goes, the eye cannot see itself. So when other people appreciate our culture and they help educate us on it, this book does that. But the question is still out there. Was there anything else in the book that other folks or things that jumped out at you? Or things that I shared that jumped out at you?
That's my question would be just comparing and contrasting what was going on there at the time, what was going on in the United States, and what was the feedback or the reaction of the Americans during that time, and what was the reaction of the individuals who were, doing these things to the South Africans at that time. So it seems like there was no, it seems like there was no united force to condemn some of these things that were going on. And I want to kind of get some sort of feedback regarding that.
Someone to react, but I could say, number one, it was filtered. I mean, actual fact, two examples for me is when I used to read the Newsweek, the international version, you thought Nkomo, who was one of the persons in Zimbabwe, was going to win the election in Zimbabwe, which is formerly Rhodesia. So I could tell that our news media was filtered in that. And then again, in the United States, we didn't oftentimes hear from the real or the indigenous people in South Africa. So again, remember who controls our media, the megalomaniacs who have a lot of money. And so they're always going to print or publish sometimes not that independent journalistic point of view. And so those of us who want to know about what happens in some country may have to go to other countries to figure out their journalism, their websites, to see that. But yeah, it was a lot of this was not in the news. We saw what happened in Charlottesville, we saw what happened in some of the things that happened with Biko and so on, but the outcry was not there from us as the United States, either as African Americans or Americans in general, to push back at apartheid until that whole apartheid movement started to grab hold years later. Because this should have happened back in 1948. It should have happened in 1913. Some of the things that we saw in the book. But again, Plate, when he came to visit, he did not get the groundswell of people endorsing him on the level to push back at those illegal or repressive regimes. Just like if you look at what happened in Nazi Germany, I use that as an example, there were a lot of people in this country who looked the other way. And again, part of it is about we sometimes don't always help people in other countries to the point we should. Other feedback, other reactions. There's another question here. Walden, let's ask or talk. Marie? I see somebody.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Somebody else?
Yes, I have a question. So I was reading about the Natives Land Act of 1913. It seemed like that's when when he started writing this book, or at least when he started initially bringing the idea of documenting this. And I was wondering if, I don't know if anyone is from Botswana or South Africa, was Natives Land Act of 1913 taught in schools, or is it something that was, I guess taught in schools? In your primary school or maybe even college?
No, none of it was taught. Can I just jump in and say it?
Sure.
Yeah, no, they didn't teach us anything. Like you only experienced it because there were laws. They just used to send police officers to like neighborhoods with some, what do you call it? The loud hailers, what are they called? You know, those things. And they'll just tell you from now on, you're not allowed to do this, move out, or do this, or do that, don't do this, don't do that. And the communities were so separate, like Black people were not allowed into white neighborhoods. They didn't even know what the government was planning until the last minute when government decided to enforce whatever law they had made up. And I think if I can just, like I told you, they only taught Africans back in Plaki's days. Your education level reached only up to like grade 4 or 6, if you're lucky. There were no higher institutions of learning. All Africans were taught was to do like, what's the word? To be carpenters and plumbers and all those kind of things, to serve the white market and just be like, to provide labor for the white farms and the mines. So at school, all they did was to teach you about, you know, religion, how to sing songs, how to make simple arithmetic, solve mentally arithmetic problems mentally. And, you know, there were no books to speak of pretty much. And all you had to do was to learn how to do a little cursive, how to write a little bit. That's it.
Gotcha. I thought somebody else had, thank you. Somebody else has another question coming in. And we probably got about 12 minutes left or so.
I just wanted, Maureen Waldron, I'm in Omaha. I just wanted to say thank you for doing this, because I knew so little about apartheid, except it was a bad thing. And, you know, you knew the general story, but to read the idea that natives are being removed. I mean, native means someone who lives there, who owns that land. And I think, you know, it's the exact same thing we did to the Native Americans. We just decide at some point, we know better. And so we're going to just take your land. We're going to come to your country and take you to work for us. And I just am astonished at human nature and a little disappointed. That's all. Thanks.
Appreciate it. Thank you. And matter of fact, the book, I think, alludes to that. Thank you very much. I see there's another question that's out here at Matriarchal World. Basically, someone says chapter 7 seemed to indicate that the matriarchal world was indigenous in many African countries or in Africa, like the Native Americans. Is his observation valid? I would say someone would throw out and respond to that. Could be a loaded question too. In other words, basically the women controlled a lot. The men and women were together. I didn't see it when I was in Botswana, South Africa. I didn't see a lot of what we call single parent households. The women had their roles and so on. And again, in the case of my mother-in-law, she and her husband were not together at the time when I met him. But I do know there were single parent households, but women played their role and it was really defined. And I can go more so by Botswana when I observed more so than that. But again, as a person who's only there for 2 years, I don't want to pass myself as an expert because again, I was only there for 2 years. Unlike some of the people I met who go for 2 weeks and now they're experts on people's countries. But any other feedback on that? The matriarchal role of, was it like Native Americans in the United States? But you always have to know about Native Americans here too. No response, then we can move on to the next one. Did you know that Nelson Mandela remained in the U.S. list of terrorism even during the Clinton administration? I also know this, yeah, I didn't know that, but I knew that he was turned in by the CIA. When we looked at literature, and if you look at what our CIA has been doing to other countries and involved in some of these horrific things, if we can unravel and look at a lot of their internal documents, you can see that happen. But can you imagine Mandela being on that all the way up into the Clinton administration as a freedom fighter and someone who spent that many years in prison? So it says something about our international spy or organizations like the CIA and of course the FBI. Someone has another question here. Can we describe for the group some of the racist laws so you can get a sense of how hideous those laws were? And also read that they would turn off the electricity at certain times as a condition of apartheid. I do know they have brownouts today and they have load shedding. They use that term in South Africa. Also happens a little bit, I think, in Botswana. But yeah, they did all kinds of things. And as I alluded to earlier, that a lot of the stuff was done in those rooms where there were no Africans, indigenous Africans, and they make up laws. Sometimes we can relate to that in the United States. There are things that go on in back rooms and people make up decisions and they float them out as law speakers or whatever. And again, people don't have much input in that. So yeah, that happens. Someone said, is it Ron saying, I say it depends upon which African tribe, not all. So in other words, are some African tribes more different areas and so on, how they deal with the man, female, matriarchal, patriarchal roles. I just know how our role was in our family, what I observed, but I cannot make a generalization. I do know the different countries, they operate different in terms of how they deal with gender issues. Oh, one little side thing is that in Botswana, they have an unusual way of dealing with the pronouns of male, female. So sometimes you hear people refer to people in the different gender and it was just normal. And again, people here get real sensitive about where you want to say man, woman, gender. And over there, their pronouns are much more neutral, which is fascinating. And so it was another thing that I noticed that people would do oftentimes refer to the different genders and different pronouns.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm wondering that from what you read, is there anything that's currently still happening?
I have to laugh because when people visit South Africa 2016, you can see the residue. That's like saying, and again, I don't say this disrespectfully, but it's like saying if you come to the United States, can we see the impact of apartheid or segregation that happened in the United States in the 1930s, 40s, even post-slavery days? And you see the residues by the vast accumulation of wealth in the hands of the few. The great forms, when Mandela came into power and again, the subsequent ANC government, some of the leaders became somewhat corrupt, or they somewhat did deal with some of the distribution or what we call reparations. And one of the things that I say, if you look at, there's a high poverty level, high crime level, all these is related to vast maldistribution of wealth. Some will all call it capitalism, but again, as Franz Fanon says, that when you look in terms of race and capitalism, they're so intertwined, it's hard to separate them, particularly at the bottom. But yeah, you can see the results of what that is. Even in townships, there are certain where people live. Now they don't have laws on the book that I'm aware of that you can't go and live in other parts of town. But again, if you don't have the income, you will see some of the shanty towns or some of the different places, obviously in South Africa, where they look like they did even before we had independent government. We got about 8 minutes left, and I'm looking at, there's a question here. There is a question. Okay, other feedback, other reactions, anything else? Those of you who have been quiet or who have not utilized their vocal cords today. Anyone else? Reactions? We got about a minute, then we get into the closure. Let's go. Yeah. Any last minute comments before I move into the closure? So I can give time for people to complete an evaluation if we can. Anything else?
As my last take home point would be, where do we go from here after reading this book, right? Where do we go from here? We understand some of the things that went on over there in the continent and some of the things that go on here, and we can see some stark similarities. Where do we go from here? And,
go ahead.
And it seems as if when there's an injustice going on with Africans and Black people in this country, is that a lot of people remain silent. I think that's a huge issue, and I think this book taught us that you cannot remain silent on issues dealing with racism, dealing with segregation, dealing with the genocide of the people. And it was great that you also discussed what happened in Namibia, because I didn't know that until recently. And we don't know these things, right? And this is why these lectures and educating ourselves is equally important, because if we don't educate ourselves on things like this, they're bound to continue. So great take home points, and I appreciate everyone's participation and coming to this forum, because I think I am a better person now after learning about some of these things that went on.
Great, thank you. Feedback, and we're at the close. Appreciate it. 2 quick points I would say. Number one, I think we need to ensure in our own environments that we don't allow our systems and our communities to practice segregation of apartheid. And I use Omaha as an example. Omaha is like 33% people of color, but if you go into City Hall, county government, state government, you will have all white meetings and groups deciding things on behalf of the public or the poor or people of color. And so one of the things I learned about South Africa, and I learned it from a South African guy when I was trying to get involved in some of the anti-apartheid movement, he pulled me aside. He said, brother, in a sense, you also got to go and work on in the United States and deal with some of theirs and get them off our back. Some of these issues we may be able to solve on our own, but again, the United States and governments are supporting this kind of a capitalist segregated environment. So that'd be one. Number two, we need to challenge our own selves to make sure that we're much more eclectic, being around people who may be different from us. And I must tell people, one of the things that helped me to be much more international was my treatment and how people were so nice to me in Botswana. When I came back, I got involved in the anti-apartheid movement. I made a point to be around people who were involved in the struggle in social justice. There's that Billy Preston song I like saying, is that nothing from nothing nothing from nothing leaves nothing. If you want to be about something, you got to be with, if you want to be with me, you got to be about something. We got to be able to be in motion. Our systems, again, we look the other way. It reminds me again of what happened in Rwanda, what happened in Bosnia, what happened in other parts of the world where people are unjust in Central and South America, even Mexico. So I think the takeaway from us is to be much more involved in our local and national political structures, but also raise powerful questions and don't allow ourselves to be in a room like it. I'm not be funny, but I'm not gonna mention UNO where they have a chancellor meeting, and I walked by their room one day, and it was like 15 white folks at the university at UNO, which is again a diverse university. How does that work out? And what are you talking about? Is it a Klan meeting? I went back to my Black Studies class, said I just witnessed a Klan meeting. Everybody started laughing. I was serious. If you're not about making sure that the systems are open and fluid and again, give people equal opportunity, then it becomes lip service. So we need to be able to address that. We do have an evaluation we'd like you to fill out. One of the things that I partner also with the Omaha Afro Omaha was that they have a book club. And so we would like to see if more and other organizations may want to do more with book clubs. There's a couple of ones that I've joined nationally, and there's only like 2 or 3 people doing book clubs. Again, we do have short attention spans. So I would like to maybe get feedback. Is this something we want to continue? If we can hand the baton off to another place, another group to maybe lead some discussions, but more would like to branch out in terms of things that we're doing to bring the worlds together. As my colleague talks about, we live in our separate universes. So this can be that opportunity for us to learn not only about each other's culture, background, and history, because we know the institutions that created some of these cesspools are not going to undo it or unravel it because it's not in their interest. So this is where I think it becomes much more for us to deal with this as a collective individual level, but also a group level of reversing that. Any other last minute comments? And we're right at the last, almost at the point of closing down. Fill out the evaluation. If we do have an email, we can actually email you a copy of the evaluation and give us feedback. And you can catch up with us moreomaha.org. This video or this recording will be on our website, as well as a PowerPoint that I ran through, or as I say, I swallowed through quickly or something. But I would like to leave you with 2 quick points. Number one, whenever you leave somebody, Samaya Sinte, as you say goodbye in a sense, and it's very important. And you go into the room, you greet people. And so I learned that in Botswana. I used to get tired at first, but I learned how the importance of being respectful and respecting your elders. And again, some of the powerful things that. And then the second thing I think is probably the most important one is that oftentimes we as Africans, and there isn't a book written like this, we do things for our children and those children who are not yet born. So again, what kind of world do we want to leave this place? We may have found it in disarray, but what do we want to be our legacy for our grandchildren or even our relatives or whoever, that we've made it better? Because at the end of the day, folks, Plate's book helped me to understand that we stand on his shoulders as other Africans who've done what they've done. And so, as Peter Tosh says in his book, in his song, no matter where you come from, if you're Black, you're an African. Well, the same thing happened in terms of some Europeans in this country. People are connected to where they come from. And so we cannot ignore that or deny that history. And we must begin to make that situation much better, not only in our societies, but also in our globe. So on that note, I would like to end by saying thank you for participating today. Hopefully we can do more of these. Feel free to fill out the evaluation. And as always, Ann, may the force be with you. Baroko.